So thank you to the European Covered Bonds Council for inviting me to speak here. I was asked to talk about what's going to happen in Brussels for the next 5 years. I will have about 15 minutes, but I think when you think of sort of these longer term projects, it's good to just look at the political priorities, and many of them have already come true in the previous panels and speeches, because you can really sense this sort of changing European Union like in the past years. And just as we go through this, I think it's a really important thing to remember that in 2014, when the Commission changed as well, just as now, if you would have sat here in 2014, the climate green was not a priority for the European Commission, certainly not in the financial services space. I don't think there was anything on like sort of sustainable finance really in place back then. There was no unit in DG FISMA dealing with sustainable finance. And it's really the COP21 deal that really made this sort of happen. And that's also just my point. When you think of this, things will change over the past 5 years. I can tell you all kinds of things now. Maybe in 2 years' time, it's all wrong. Who knows? So it's a good moment to talk about this, I think, because we have a bit of a wild year in Brussels. We have done a European Parliament election. That's over. That was in May. We have appointed a new council president, which happened in July. We're almost ready to appoint the new European Commission, both Ursula von der Leyen as the new president, but also the college as a whole. And we have also almost appointed Christine Lagarde as the new president of the ECB. So just when you think about this, so this was a period from May until now, essentially, and this does not happen in a vacuum, right? Like sort of these positions, these very important sort of developments, they happen in a political context. The EU is political, just like any member state. And actually, the EU's politics are to a large extent defined by those politics in those member states. And I want to just show you a few pictures to illustrate this. So this is Angela Merkel. I hope you all know. She represents, from a Brussels perspective, sort of the stable Europe, the center-right, the big center-right that's sort of going through making the deals in council. There have been a few cracks in the shield lately. Merkel has been weakened domestically in Germany, and also the EPP itself, so the center-right group, has been weakened in the last parliament elections. This is Emmanuel Macron. He is the new sort of knight in shining armor for the EU, I suppose, because he's a man with ideas. He comes with a positive vision of the EU, not like something that is modeling through. It's really, we need to do something. That's where, a lot of the green impetus comes from, but also on the trade front, on the industrial policy front. This man, maybe a little bit less known, but nonetheless, this is Pedro Sanchez. He's the Prime Minister of Spain. And so what he represents for me is this quiet resurrection of the center-left, because actually, when you look at Mrs. von der Leyen, new commission, you have more members of this group of the center-left in that college than from the center-right. So you can see that especially in the south and also in the Scandinavian countries, that actually the center-left has been really resurrected. And it's like these figures like Pedro Sanchez that really sort of represent this new energy on that side of the political aisle. These people are what you would call the Eurosceptics. So we have Matteo Salvini, Marine Le Pen, I believe Geert Wilders even, for the Dutch amongst you. They are the internal threat to the EU. They did well in the European elections, but they didn't do as well as they had hoped. And what is more, I think that what you have seen after the elections, that they basically failed a little bit to really consolidate their powers in the parliament. And I also think that the fall of the Italian government recently also is a blow, because Salvini was sort of the strongest person in this group. And then last but not least, this is Boris Johnson. For the non-German speakers, that means hashtag Europe is the answer. And it's a campaign poster from the SPD. I think it's brilliant. I don't want to talk about Brexit, but even though there is really a fatigue in Brussels around this topic, you cannot sort of wish it away, and it is something that really is holding back sort of whatever you want to do with the EU at this point. And let's see how long it will go on. So, what has happened in the parliament elections in May? I think if you want to remember a few things about this, is that this was not an earthquake election. This was a pretty standard one. The main thing that happened, which will really have an impact, is that the center left and center right are no longer able to make deals amongst themselves. It's a big difference. It's the first time in a long time that that's not possible, which means that the centrist group, the liberals of Macron, or de facto led by Macron's En Marche movement, and also the Greens will be taken into account much more. And so what I think is that you will see a subtle shift in the parliament to the left compared to what we have now. And that's also due to the decreased influence of the EPP, which is sort of the CDU, CSU, and sister parties. You can clearly see that in sort of possible majorities. And I mean, just to be clear, this is not really going to change after Brexit, by the way. Like at Brexit, there will be, you know, MEPs will have to leave, but it's not really changing the fundamentals here. And I think, you know, realistically, you will see a parliament that is going to be much more sort of, you know, it will be less based on a few people making deals. They will have to like build bigger consensuses. But all in all, what is important, and I think that that was sort of the fear before the elections, is that you would have some kind of a blocking force that could really stop things moving forward. The parliament will keep working as it does. The second big event this year was in July, so that was when the top jobs were appointed. So we have Ursula von der Leyen as Commission President, Charles Michel as Council President, and Christine Lagarde as ECB President. So these are the three top jobs in the EU, you know, fabric. I mean, aside from gender balance, this is not a very balanced choice, Ryan, because like this is really France and Germany, with the country that's sort of a mix between France and Germany. It's sitting in between. So you would have a. This has been controversial. The Eastern Europe, or Central and Eastern Europe, is not happy with this. The new center left is not happy with this choice, because this is, again, I mean, especially when you consider that Christine Lagarde is, you know, okay, so Macron does like sort of like her, and while Ursula von der Leyen was actually put forward by Macron, this feels really like sort of a French-German sort of deal that's been made. And so luckily for Charles Michel and Christine Lagarde, they don't really have to worry too much about this, because they have been appointed more or less. But Ursula von der Leyen needs to be passed through Parliament, because a European Commission president needs to be approved. Yeah. So what you have seen with von der Leyen in recent months is that she's really started making concessions, particularly to the left. And that's where also this ever-increasing focus on green comes from, partly, because, you know, as Lucas said, like this whole idea of a Green New Deal, that sort of comes from that, where von der Leyen feels that she needs to give something to the Greens, give something to the center left. And so this is it. This is the new team. It's a sort of a concentric circle. This is actually taken from the Commission itself, where you will see that, like, actually for financial services, the situation is relatively straightforward, I think, because Dombrovskis has been given a vice presidency role, which means that he is one of the leading people in the Commission, but also he's been given direct control over DG FISMA as sort of the financial services directorate. For other sectors, it's vastly more complex than that, because you can have a vice president and a commissioner and etc. in charge. But I would emphasize, though, that sort of Dombrovskis will certainly be the key commissioner, but there will also be other commissioners that will have their say about financial services in a broader sense. If you think of Timmermans in his Green Deal, sustainable finance, green finance, it will partly fall under his remit. I think the whole digital challenge with Sylvie Goulard from France is in charge of DG Connect. Will also have her say about financial services, and so on and so on. So it's not only about Dombrovskis, but like from a financial services perspective, there is like quite some continuity with the previous system. So what does this mean? Because, you know, all of this has really like shaped like sort of a new list of priorities. And as I said, I mean, it's only a recent guess that we have here. I would say if you want to remember one thing from this, is that financial services is no longer sort of a goal in itself when it comes to sort of policy. Financial services is very important. And like, of course, you have things like the Basel IV implementation, etc., that will just go on. But it will fit much more in sort of other priorities: sustainability, technology, industrial policy, third country relations. We've spoken about sort of covered bonds as a potential success story outside. This is, you know, for the Commission and for other EU policymakers. Covered bonds is a European success story. Why not internationalize it? Europe can take the lead on sustainable finance as well. We are probably the furthest evolved, especially with the US lagging behind at the moment. So, and I think that sort of also, in terms of the dialogue with policymakers, is that sort of the industry needs to sort of be aware of this more and sort of to really think, well, how can I contribute to these other goals aside from just like my narrow interest? And I think the work that the ECBC is doing around energy efficient mortgages is a perfect example of that, because that really fits into what actually the Commission wants to achieve. So specifically for financial services, I think, you know, these political priorities, they will sort of set to a large extent sort of the new agenda. So like, I mean, it is almost certain, and that's one of the things that you can be sort of write down and be sure of, is that there will be a big push on sustainable finance, on green. And as someone said on the panel before, is that like this will evolve into more an ESG agenda than just green, because the social aspects as well will come through this. And I mean, of course, there is the ongoing work on taxonomy, on green bonds, but there will be more. And what is just interesting to think is that, you know, financial services legislation can serve as a vehicle for everything. If you look the securitization regulation that passed 2 years ago, it already like inserted sort of a mandatory requirement that if there is something on energy efficiency available from an underlying asset, that you need to disclose it. It's a small thing, but you can see that, you know, in this non-sustainable finance pieces of law, you also have those elements in there. And that will continue to happen. And I think the same on digital. I think the fintech side of things will be an extremely important area as well. But the slight difference, I think that there is less sort of the feeling that you need to regulate this. This is maybe something a bit more where you want to, you know, see what happens a little bit with innovation. But you can expect sort of that the relationship between the big tech giants and the financial services sector, and the platformization of like sort of especially the distribution of financial services, and including also in the payment space, for example, is going to be high on the agenda. I think Ms. von der Leyen said yesterday that Europe needs its digital sovereignty back. Right? Like, so what happens if all of our data is in the hands of Americans? I mean, those kind of questions will be very high up on the agenda. I think artificial intelligence will be big, quite early on in the mandate. Important also from a mortgage perspective to see how you use that in sort of in risk assessment. So there's all those things, and maybe lastly, you can see already in the new Commission that they're trying to sort of turn the lens around a little bit and really look at the consumer and like sort of the people when you look at financial services and other legislation as well. And I think that's not necessarily new. That's always been there, but it's going to be something like there's an upcoming review of the Mortgage Credit Directive and some other things. You will see that sort of that idea of consumer protection and sort of how can I make this work for consumers and not just for the industry will be an important one as well. I will leave it with that. It's coffee break, so that's always good. Thank you very much.